before we can really get into lighting our scene and adding our artistic flavors to it, we need to quickly go over light maps, how they're made, and some of the important key points you want to keep across all of your light maps. So light maps are essentially a secondary UV channel on your mesh asset. And what it's going to do is, in Unreal, it's going to come to bake time, and when the lighting is baked for your level, it's going to create a much smaller texture for every individual asset that is flagged for light maps and build a really low res texture to get all that really nice lighting detail baked down into it. So again, these textures are really small. They're generally like, depending on what size you have them, but like by 64 by 64, 128 by 128. So they're pretty small. They're nothing too crazy. They can even go up to 1K in some cases for some assets, but generally they're pretty small and, not bigger than like a 256. Again, it's going to depend on whatever your asset is, but for small props, you keep them pretty small, as it's essentially just getting lighting data in a black and white image and multiplying it on top of your asset to give it that look of lighting. So when we're coming into creating light maps, what we're going to want to do is open our just UV set editor, and here's just this kind of like little wall piece or, whatever kind of asset you have. Let's say it has multiple different textures and shaders applied to it. So we'll have this like tiling wall material. We have like just a cut right down here, as we have like possibly a different type of trim texture. We have it up here as well. There's another UV cut for that. And then of course, whatever this window or just kind of middle section of detail could be. So one of the big problems with light maps is that if you just came in here and then you fit this into your 1:1 UV ratio, which is what you're going to need to do for light maps, they need to be in the 1:1 scaling, you're going to get these issues of light map seams. Now, since these are really small textures, you're going to get a lot of extra bleed over in these UVs if they're not, perfectly lined up. So it's going to make this, a black and white texture essentially, and then it'll fill in different areas with different values of gray of where it's supposed to be lighter or darker. So if we have like this area and it's all filled in with like maybe white, or it's a gradient of white in here, which would be like, let's say this texture right here, it's gradient upward, it's getting some nice ambient occlusion lighting going in, so it's dark at the bottom and then it gradiates upwards and gets whiter up here. The problem is, if you have this kind of split that is along this edge, there's a good chance we're gonna get some lighting artifacts and you'll see that seam in there. You're never really gonna get these kind of like areas and pixels to line up exactly and have the exact same color. So you're gonna get a noticeable seam and it'll create a much harsher look. So what we want to do for a lot of assets is have the least amount of UV shells as possible. Now, the great thing is, on your light maps, you don't really need to worry about whatever the textures are, whatever different types of shaders are applied. It's all just taking your one asset that you have and kind of all combining it into one solid light map. So to create a secondary UV channel, we just have to come up to UV and go down to the UV set editor, and then we can just click new to create a new light map channel. Now, normally I like to just name these L map for light map, just so I always know that that's what that light map channel or that secondary UV channel is. Now, if we click and go back and forth, we can see we've actually lost all of our light map data, or our UVs from our previous, starting point. Sometimes this is totally fine if you just want to start fresh and start like on a new UV, but generally you just kind of want to keep whatever you had and maybe adjust things to kind of fit your needs. So what we can do is we can go to UV sets in our UV editor window, and we can do copy UVs from UV set. So we'll copy what we have selected, map 1, to our light map channel. Now, when we click on them, we have our UVs in our new light map channel. So this is a great starting off point, and we can just basically go in and fix a lot of the issues that we would run into if we just left these kind of seams in here. Now, not everything has to be attached into one solid object that could potentially distort your kind of like UVs and really kind of break things. However, getting some of these things attached is going to be beneficial to us in the long run. So we can just select these and we can just kind of come down and stitch them together. Again, this is a really simple object, but this is just the idea. Now when we get kind of any kind of gradiating colors or any like light map data, we're going to get a really nice transition. If you had, for instance, an object like this and it was maybe rotated in, it was just kind of like intersecting here, what's going to happen is when you bake lighting, you're going to get some nice ambient occlusion and darkening where these two items intersect. Now, if we had this scene here, the gradient potentially can have a lot of artifacting and errors. And so we're just trying to help avoid that. When it is a nice full seamed up mesh like this, you're going to get a lot better results. Now for some insets, like this, depending on how deep they are, you might want to not kind of like attach them. However, on something small like this, we could easily just stitch these together and then stitch these endpoints. Just come in here and just kind of stitch these two together. Now, some of the reasons for doing this is it's going to give us a bit nicer kind of like edge bleeding along these interior angles here. We're going to get a nicer kind of rounding fall off. We can also even stitch in our main UV shell here, which again, of course, since we did like the move and sew, it kind of just stitched it in nicely for us. And so what we're going to get is we're going to get all these really nice kind of ambient occlusion transitions, and they'll all seam up nicely. We won't have to worry about any potential, little 1 pixel maybe right here that was white that would bleed into this guy right here. We're going to get a nice kind of darkening effect throughout this. And then of course we just want to make sure that we scale it down and fit it into our 1:1 UV ratio. And it can be any kind of rotation, doesn't matter. But this is just how we're going to quickly set up our light maps. And then we can just, of course, export it into Unreal, and then we'll get our light maps and we'll be able to go from there. Now that we're back in Unreal, we just want to import our mesh that we created and be able to just set up a few flags to make sure that we have the correct light map settings that we want. So we'll just bring this in. Now, when you first bring in an asset, it's going to ask you if you want to, create your own or Unreal's own light maps, which is a great way to kind of go about creating some assets. Sometimes, especially when you're starting out maybe, and you don't have time to create, light maps, or the asset is still changing, you might want to have this check mark that says generate light map UVs, and Unreal will try to generate its own secondary channel of light map UVs that could potentially work for your asset. It does its best to kind of like unwrap the object, but it's never going to be very pretty. And generally, unless it's something that is basically just cards, like if you were unwrapping leaf cards or like tree cards, those generally can kind of work out pretty well with the generate light maps. But other than that, you're going to want to create your own custom light maps. You don't want to spend too much time, but generating like light maps here, if you tick this on, it'll do it for you and you'll get some quick results. And then of course, we can just re-import the asset without that checked on so that it'll import your own light maps. So we'll just click import and then open up our static mesh. Now to see if we have our correct UVs on here, we can just take a look at the UV window right here. And you can see there are 2 channels. Now if we imported this without the light map channel and without generating automatic UVs, there would only be 1 channel, which is kind of our texture right here, which we saw in Maya. Let's just switch this up real quick. But there is our original kind of UVs, and that's reflected here in Unreal. Now the secondary channel right here, channel 1, is our light map channel. And we can see that bringing in our custom light map, it switched it up and now it has this really nice light map. So that's pretty much all you have to do to set up custom light maps. It's fairly easy, but it definitely will help your assets go a long way and reduce a lot of the issues when you try and seam up things as much as possible. Some things just are never going to be able to seam up really easily. So when you can, and you can get some really nice kind of like seams going, and things just are no longer having these kind of like cut edges that you can see along here, those are good things you want to try and do, and just to try and reduce the amount of lighting and artifact errors you could potentially have. Atmospheric fog is not the only type of fog we can add to our scene. The other type we can add is exponential height fog, and this will allow you to get some really nice foggy, kind of densely atmospheric environments into your scene. It's a little bit different. Atmospheric fog is more of just, it's trying to simulate what the atmosphere is like, having some type of fog and essentially atmosphere that the sun is pouring through, and it's allowing you to change those colors and kind of give a little bit more density to that. Whereas the exponential height fog is more of what is the fog in the scene itself, like where are these like low-lying clouds that you're essentially traversing through, which is creating all this dense fog. So we can just come in here and drag it into our scene, and we can already see instantly that our scene is just a bit more foggy. So we get rid of that, you can see the fog is already starting to turn on and starting to add to our environment. So we have the fog density slider, which of course just makes things more or less dense. It kind of stops at this extremely low number, 0.05. The main reason for that is because with a lot of transparent objects such as water or glass or ice, for example, they have a hard time dealing with fog. They don't render very well, and they also can extremely increase the amount of rendering time you have to deal with. So they kind of clamp it down at this value that's fairly low in the just default, just drag and slide ability, as they don't want it to go too high. Otherwise, you're going to start to see a lot of artifacting and issues with something like water or glass. So we can take a look at this in terms of the water right here. If I increase this to a really high number, say 1, you can see that the rendering of this water shader is not behaving as you would expect the fog to kind of like overlap on top of it. That's because you're getting way too many draw calls, and it would just be way too expensive to render these things. You of course could go in and try and adjust the water shader to kind of better match what is happening with the fog, which is something you might have to do if you do have glass or water in your scene and you want some extremely dense heavy fog like this. However, you will potentially not be able to get the exact look just due to the fact that it doesn't work that well with the kind of water shaders. So just keep that in mind. If you do run into those issues, that could be part of it. So we can say, let's have like 0.5, it's still pretty dense fog. And then we can mess around with some of the other settings. We have the kind of fog color, which just defaults this kind of like, kind of wet-ish kind of blue color, but you could also, go for like a orangish color to get that kind of sandy, more Blade Runner-esque feeling. Just really kind of increase the saturation, maybe just drop the darkness down a bit, increase the kind of density to something like 1.5, and then we're starting to get closer to that example image I showed earlier that was from Blade Runner, that had that really heavy fog, and really all you're getting are these like silhouettes. These like tree silhouettes are very much akin to the kind of statues, so you're getting those to kind of pop out of the fog, but all your details are kind of getting lost in it. And for some scenes, that's kind of what you want to go for. You want to have that really deep foggy feeling. But we can already see this just like quick little ice plane I put in here. It's not properly affecting the fog as you would expect it to do. So there can be some problems, especially if you're changing the color a lot. With its normal blue, it's maybe not standing out as bad, but you're still getting this harsh line. So make sure you are very aware of these kind of limitations of the height fog. It is a great thing to add, but it can cause some issues if you put the density just too high. The next we have is kind of the fall off. And the fall off really is kind of like wherever your kind of like fog little locator is essentially going to be where the kind of middle of the fog is. The higher you raise it up, you're going to get this just gradually falling density of fog. If you lower it to the ground, you're going to get more of kind of like a ground fog layer. And this is going to be throughout your entire environment, although it is unfortunately only on one static plane. There's no way to kind of adjust exactly where it is in world space. So if you wanted ground fog to kind of cover every inch of your landscape, but you had like a lot of undulation, that is going to be kind of difficult. However, you can get some cool effects where you do get your mountains kind of poking out of the fog, and if you increase this density really high, you can start to get these kind of cliffs in the fog that are just all kind of like poking out. But again, if you do have water, you are going to get some of those issues. So you might need to, replace the water if you're going to have an extremely foggy day with a more simple, less transparent kind of shader. Something that is opaque, but still could fake the illusion that there is water down there. Having this kind of water that's refracting the sky is, of course, going to create those problems. But you can see we get this really nice kind of snowy valley feeling now. We're dropping the kind of just the fall off up here, and so it's kind of like, okay, we're gonna have nice clear skies, but we're dipping the fog down, so it's just all this nice ground height. And of course you can just kind of grab your little manipulator tool and like raise it up to get that even higher, so it's just like it looks like the snow is just really rolled in. It's just really foggy, but if you're on the tops of these cliffs, you can kind of see back and you can just barely see some of the valley. So that's a great way to just kind of test things out, get some really cool and unique looks in there. Well, let's just set this back, something a little more workable with. Then we have the max fog opacity, and this is just kind of like how opaque is the fog, and what it's going to do is it's going to start to kind of pull back the fog from the background of your scene all the way to the foreground. So as you can see, it's pretty dense in the background, and then as you pull it forward, it's going to become less and less foggy until you get up close, and then you do have that fog kind of in the foreground. So that is something to just kind of be aware of if you want to like just pull the fog in towards the viewer themselves. Then we also have the start distance, where you can just kind of like push where the fog is. If you want a nice heavy fog feeling kind of like around your tree line, but you just don't want like any kind of foreground objects you have to just be blown out by this fog, that's a great way to do it. You can just kind of like really just set this back to like a kind of a distant plane where you're like, okay, this is kind of good. I want like these areas fogged out. And then you just, have everything in your foreground nicely lit up and kind of really highlighting very well. The next thing we're going to look at for the exponential height fog is volumetric fog. And that's going to kind of add just a volume around the entire space full of this fog. It's going to, if you like hover over it, you're going to see that it no longer takes in start distance, max fog opacity, and fog cutoff distance into effect. It's giving a more scalable kind of control, but you are losing some of those kind of default controls that we have up here that we set. So if we turn this on, we instantly lose some of those like default settings that we had, and now we have the ability to kind of come in here and adjust some of these different settings. And as you can see, it's no longer being affected by just whatever your height is, wherever you put this little locator. It's just essentially fog everywhere. So that is something you might want to, include in your environment. But we, of course, can kind of come in here and change the fog color as well, and, make whatever kind of effect and look we want. We also have the ability to add an emissive, which kind of will make things glow a bit. You just kind of increase this a bit, and then you'll start to get like some more of a kind of bloomed out glow effect from this kind of emissive addition to it. And then you can change the view distance, which is essentially very much like the start distance. Now the main thing for this is it really just kind of gives you a better kind of volumetric look if you want this kind of like really kind of crazy volume of fog throughout your entire environment. The sky is completely blown out from fog. There's really nothing. If you don't have a skybox and you don't really want one, this is a great way to go, as you can kind of get this really cool, really neat effect. But you can, of course, just change the density around so it's nothing too crazy. Again, the density is the one you want to like play with the most to really kind of get a feeling of however your fog is going to be. But just adding in these simple little things, we can see that we can get some really cool, really unique effects and results from our sky, our fog, and just our lighting setup. We can just, again, change the light source, rotate it around to get some different views in our environment, and then match our skybox as well to kind of change the type of day it is, and then increase the fog density to be something that, really gives us a really nice mood and atmosphere to our scene. So we'll just come in here, maybe make it a little bit more green, a little blue-green, kind of darken it up a bit. And we just instantly have a much different kind of feeling environment, It's more of a murky kind of area now. We can also come in here and get this more sandy look. If, we had a sand textures here instead of these snow ones, it will feel more like we're in the desert. So there's just a bunch of great little tools and things you can do to really give your environment a different feeling throughout. Just by messing around with the fog and atmosphere and adding in these elements is really going to help set your environment apart from everyone else who basically just has a blue sky, which, if that's what you want for your environment, that's totally fine. I'm just saying that adding in these little extra touches can really help sell your environment as something different, and it's something that's going to attract viewers more, as it's not, just your normal blue sky kind of feeling. It's going to want the viewer to invest in and explore the image more. So these are all things to kind of keep aware of and keep in mind for creating a dynamic environment. The final key for baking an environment and making sure that you have really good light mass settings in any particular area that you're working on is we need to create a light mass importance volume. And that's just under the volumes tab in your regular modes panel. Now, when you drag this into your scene, you'll get a little box. Now, unlike some of the things like fog and everything that essentially wrap around your entire environment, we need to actually scale this to be the size of whatever our environment is. The reason for this is it needs to encompass everything that is important to light mass, which is Unreal's lighting and baking solution, and understands that this is what's really important. Put all your kind of like priorities and high detail in these areas. If you don't have a light mass importance volume in a given area, you're gonna have lower quality bakes. So you need to like scale it up to fit whatever the size of your environment is. You also don't have to scale it up. You could just do it here by the X, Y, and Z if you want, but just using the little gizmo is fairly simple. But if you need to like increase it, significantly, we can just maybe set 50, 50, and then 50. And now we have this huge kind of like bucket that is scaled throughout our environment. And if you're having some difficulty seeing your scene, you can easily just go into like your exponential fog height and then just turn off the visibility for right now. So that way you can see your environment and see where you need this light mass importance volume to go. If you don't have one in your scene, you're gonna get like a few errors every time you're trying to build, and you're just gonna get low quality lighting. You want it to encompass everything that will be in the scene, so that even means like the tops of these trees. Now, if you have a big environment and you're really only needing to bake maybe, let's say like this area over here, as well as over here and over here, and this is just kind of the background little noisy areas, nothing too important. Same with this, it's just kind of like the wide mid-ground areas. You can just scale your light maps importance volume just to kind of encompass those areas that the player would actually be in and that you would need your high detail lighting. This will also speed up bake times for you, as you won't have to have the same detail and the same kind of precision that you would have in, say, the entire environment throughout if you had this just filling in the entire screen. You of course can expand it a bit more, and that's totally fine, but you need to make sure this is encompassing everything where you want your high detail lighting to be. Otherwise, you're gonna get some low, high quality results. Now, another thing to keep in mind with your building and baking is if you are needing to make a lot of quick and iterative lighting changes, you can go down here to the build settings and go to the light quality and choose which type of lighting quality you want to have for your level. The default at preview is the quickest lighting. It's just gonna give you a basic understanding of what is gonna be in your environment. Medium and high are obviously, they're gonna take a lot longer, but they're gonna give you more accurate results. And for your finals, when you are taking your final screenshots, you're gonna wanna set it to production. However, this is gonna make the lighting take a lot longer. If you have preview lighting set up and it's taking like 2 or 3 minutes, you can just exponentially increase that amount of time for each time you step up from preview to medium to high to production. So only ever set it to production on the final renders where everything is good. You've already checked it out under a high setting and medium setting to just make sure that things are looking good. You've nailed all the things you want, and then you can set it up to production to get those final screenshots and that final really good quality look for your portfolio. Now that we have our lighting and fog in place, we can start to add a post effects volume to really help enhance the look of our scene and really nail it in to get our finalized look that we're hoping to go for. Again, much like the lighting, we don't need to have our scene in the complete final state to do this. We can actually mess around with some of these things beforehand, and so we can get a good idea of how we want to add in those extra details to help some of these post effects pop out a little bit more. And then of course we can come in later and just add in those extra little spurts of detail, story moments, and extra things that will really help sell our scene to its fullest completion. So to add a post effects volume, all you have to do is just come into the volumes and then grab in the post effects volume. Now it comes in, again, much like the light mask importance volume, as a cube. However, with the post effects volume, if you scroll all the way down, you can select the infinite extend unbound box. And this will then encompass the entire screen. Everything will be filled with this post effects box. So if you just figure out whatever one post effects you want to have for your scene, you can do that. Or of course you can go ahead and just scroll it up to make it larger and fit in any one encompassing space. Now, one of the reasons why you probably would rather keep the kind of box into any one given area is that if you are playing through a scene, you can actually walk from one post effects box to another. So if we duplicate them, I could duplicate maybe some of the same settings or have different settings and just have the boxes like line up next to each other or even slightly overlap. And one of the options within the post effects box is allowing you to kind of blend between multiple post effects volumes that you're going to be going through. So if you're traveling through one and maybe here we wanted to have, maybe some intense bloom and maybe some higher reflections on the ice we have in our scene, we could easily do that. And then maybe if we come into our next kind of area, maybe we want to up the saturation on some of the colors or de-emphasize some of the other areas. Maybe we want to tone down the kind of looks of the grass that we have in this scene, so we can easily do that as well. Now that will be found if we just scroll down under the post-process volume settings. So if we come into our one volume that we created and we're like, okay, we want this one to be our main volume that we're going to be using, all we have to do is just select it and set its priority to be 1. This means anytime you're in this volume, it's going to have the highest priority. And anytime you're in a combination of one post volume and another one, whichever one has the higher number is going to take priority. And then you can adjust the blend radius. So this is like kind of the world space units of how it's blending between the two of them. And then you can have a blend weight. So you can have it kind of be a full effect blend or kind of a half blend between the two. So these are great things just keep in mind when you're setting up your volumes, is you don't need it to kind of encompass the entire world, or you don't need to be limited by just one post volume. You can have multiple different volumes. And of course, if we just check the infinite extend unbound box, we can just set up one post volume and kind of control everything with that. So some of the first options here are color grading. And this is kind of what we went back in through in the earlier scenes of being able to adjust how, films like Mad Max would adjust the kind of color balance of their entire scene with just one volume. So we're essentially doing the same thing. They're not using an Unreal volume. They're, of course, using programs in the film world. But this is essentially going to help us do the same thing. So these are kind of more geared towards kind of film effects, but they can help you get your scene and kind of enhance it to that next level. So the first thing is temperature and tint on white balance. Again, these are both kind of film things, and they might take a little bit of a deeper understanding to really kind of nail the look that you're going for. But basically what the temperature is doing is it's increasing the white balance, and that's either changing it to be a cooler tone or a warmer tone. So we can easily just kind of adjust our slider to get a warmer feel in our environment, or we can drop it down a bit to maybe get a cooler, frostier feeling. And the tint kind of cycles between more of a magenta color, kind of a reddish purple magenta, and then if we drop it down, we're getting more of a green kind of sepia tone color. So you can easily kind of play around with this and get some kind of really cool effects. So, maybe we have this kind of like purple lighting now going on. So we're dramatically changing the way our lighting looks in our environment. Even though we've set it up and maybe have adjusted some of the colors, we can easily go back in, play with some of these settings, and get a totally new and unique feel to our environment. So if we turn both of these off, we can see how quickly it went from, just a standard kind of like, it has a blue slight tint to the haze, and, maybe we increase that a bit more, and then we added a bit of purple to it to give it this kind of ambience and this, really nice feeling that's just very different than what you're normally going to see in your just typical kind of blue sky video game. We also have global control, and this will allow you to control essentially all the same kind of situations you have in Photoshop, such as the saturation. We can come in here and we can just kind of play around and change the saturation any way we want. So we can like either increase it, decrease it, change the color, get, again, just a bunch of different looks. These are slightly different than just your normal white balance, and it's one of those things that you just have to really kind of play with to find the kind of color. But it's really easy to just turn on saturation and start messing around with what the kind of look is going to be. If you come in down here, you can actually increase the saturation and the intensity of it. So, just increasing it beyond 1 is going to just kind of pop it up. And so these are like all essentially being layered on top of your scene. So if we drop our saturation down, we of course can get a black and white image, and that can give some really cool artistic kind of effects to our scene. And of course, when we move through the environment, it's not just like a static black and white image that you would see in Photoshop. It's a nicely, fully movable environment having this black and white effect, which can be really cool. Then we of course have the contrast, where we can kind of increase the contrast in our scene. We don't want to do this too much, as we might start just kind of crushing down a lot of these blacks, and that can be kind of bad if you're about to lose a lot of your detail. However, if you are going for kind of more of just a finalized artistic image where, your blacks are really crushed, your whites are really just kind of blown out, this is a good way to do that. But adding subtle contrast is always kind of a nice way to go. Just kind of pushing things. Like, I'm always a big fan of just adding that extra little bit of contrast. Is the more kind of contrast you have, it's the more just fighting between the lights and the darks. It's got more of a pop and just that really kind of intense feeling. But again, this is just really deterministic on whatever your environment and whatever kind of effect you're going for. Then we also have the gamma, which again you can mess around with. It kind of changes, more drastically than the kind of saturation, and it's changing the entirety of the image, not just adding a kind of like layered saturation on top of things. It's essentially tinting the entire screen. We also have the gain, just some similar effects. These are kind of hard to get into exactly what they do unless you have a very good understanding of kind of a deep understanding of film and photography, raw editing of photos, to kind of figure out what these definitely do. So you can just start to mess around with them and see what kind of effects you get. However, for the most part, I would say saturation and contrast are going to be the ones that you're going to want to utilize the most. You also can come in here and do some just full on screen tinting, which is, very similar to what Gamma is trying to do, but it's just much easier. It's got this nice color wheel here, and you can just easily tint the entire thing whatever kind of color you want. However, with a lot of these kind of like temperature balance and tinting abilities, they are kind of preserving some of the like shadow detail. You can change where the shadows are changing different colors. And down here we can see where we can do that. We can change the saturation of some of our shadowed areas. So if we want to like increase that a bit, maybe Let's put it to something so it's just popping out a little more. But now we can start to see that we're able to just change the kind of shadowed areas to whichever color we want. The same can be done for our midtones and our highlights. So of course, our midtones being kind of the middle area, our highlights being our bright whites and, bright vibrant colors, and then our shadows being our shadowed area. So we can change just the, kind of highlighted areas. And so you just, if it is kind of pretty blown out by, a white color, it's gonna take a bit more to get any of that kind of contrast. So just be aware that, if you are at either pure black or pure white, trying to saturate those colors is gonna be kind of difficult. So that might be why if you're struggling to get your highlights to kind of just adjust, if you just want to adjust literally only your highlights. So just remember that these are great things to just kind of mess around with and really get a good feeling for what your scene could be. Next here we have color grading, which is color grading or our LUT. Now we're about to go over that in another quick little video right after this, but I just want to let you know that it's here under the post-processing thing, and we'll see how that kind of like affects and how we can make our own lookup table and really change the scene in just Photoshop, so you don't even have to worry about potentially using all of these kind of settings. Now here we have the tone mapper options. Again, these are very more geared towards kind of film and film-esque quality kind of edits. So if you're not really familiar with that, I would generally stay away. Staying up here with these kind of easier kind of color balance situations, as well as the lookup table, will probably be a little bit easier and more user-friendly to understand kind of what's going on. But you can come in here, of course, and then just start messing around with these to see what kind of effects you can get if it's something, you're desired. But I wouldn't waste too much time with it if it's not something you're exactly looking for. Now, under lenses, we have a few effects. We have image effects, which can add some chromatic aberration, which is essentially taking your image and pushing the colors kind of off kilter. It's essentially like wherever a straight line is going to be, it's going to push the reds and greens slightly off wherever the image is. Try and see if we can get a pretty good effect here. So we can see how the kind of reds and greens are kind of like up here especially, they're being pushed away from the initial leaf, and it's giving this kind of old school kind of camera effect to our scene. It can be kind of overdone. A lot of games nowadays use it to some degree, either pretty heavily or, especially if it's more of a sci-fi game, you're getting these like blues and yellows are all being kind of pushed off the screen. It's giving this like very post-effecty look. That's a common Instagram kind of thing as well. So if you are going to use it, you're going to want to keep it subtle. It can help, some areas just where there's edges that are just a little too jagged or everything. You can give that little extra effect to it, but it's definitely not needed. And sometimes some people are just not big fans of it. So it is one of those effects where you might want to steer clear of. Next is vignetting, and vignetting is very much just like the kind of filter in Instagram, where it is darkening the edges of your scene. As you can see, they're kind of being like brought in, and it's all focusing, a nice area right in the center. This is a great way to kind of get your final screenshot that you're trying to work with and just really kind of focus the viewer into the middle of your scene. If, your focal point is in the middle and you want to really emphasize that area, or if you have this really light area here, just adding in this vignetting can create some nice contrast in the trees along here, as well as these kind of riverbanks, to really just focus in and draw the viewer into this area. You will want to be careful with it, as it can get pretty heavy-handed if you do add it on, and some people just go a little too intense. But, adding a bit in there can be nice. It's also one of the things that you can add later in Photoshop, so it's not something you have to do in the Unreal Engine. We also have grain, jitter, and intensity, and these work hand in hand. So grain is just going to add a bunch of kind of noise to your scene to give, again, that kind of old school effect, that old school photo effect. And then the jitter just kind of increases just the spacing between where those little jitter points are happening. It's great for getting that kind of old-timey effect, or just any kind of like, distortion of reality in there. We then also have bloom. And this is where we can kind of just increase the intensity of the bloom of any of our lights. especially if we have any lights that are kind of coming through some kind of like light fogs and we just really want to like blow those out. We can easily do that with the bloom effect and just kind of really increase a lot of this light here in the background. So if we just kind of reset this and we just start to increase this, a lot of those really bright highlighted areas are really getting popped out and they're getting kind of over exaggerated and exposed. And it's a great way to, again, emphasize some of these areas and just give a nice feeling to any one space of your environment. Of course, can play with the threshold and determine where you need the bloom essentially to kind of start and stop. So just moving this further back is going to remove a lot of the bloom in the front of your scene, so you don't just have it kind of like all turned on and washed out in your face. You can kind of have it so that the bloom is exaggerated here in kind of further out in the background instead of just kind of like the foreground. And of course, you can kind of change the bloom type and just see which kind of works for you. Next, we have the dirt mask, and the dirt mask essentially is going to fake the effect of something being dirty on the screen. So what we can do is you can put in just like a black and white image that has maybe some streaks on it, like water droplets or just dirt streaks, and it'll look like you're looking through a glass plane, or there's like a camera lens with kind of some dirt on it and everything's not as crystal clear. It's a cool little effect, but it's something I would stick away from for your environments. For your final screenshots, you want them to just be the really nice, pretty looking environments, and you don't really want these extra kind of in-your-face additions that are not really part of your environment. They're just a nice little camera trick. We also have the audio exposure. It's one of the things that I almost always turn off for my environments. We did it in the kind of exposure control here where we fix it at 0. If you want to just do that so when you are playing the level and the lighting isn't turned on, you just have to set both of these to 1. And that way auto exposure will be just completely off. Now, auto exposures, it is great for when you are going into a dark environment and then, you get into a really bright space and it looks like your eyes are, adapting and dilating to that just sudden change of light. And for a game, that's great. And even sometimes if you're doing just like a fly through video. However, when you're trying to determine the lighting of your scene and you're trying to nail the look of it, it's something that you really kind of want to turn off, as if you are in a dark area and you're lighting it and you're like, okay, I'm getting the lighting looking really good, and then the auto exposure is kicking in and it's brightening your scene up, and you move to another area, you're like, wait, why doesn't it look the same anymore? So it's one of those things you just kind of want to like turn off and just kind of keep it off, and then maybe play around with it once you are like changing your environment into more of a game kind of setting. As for any of your screenshots, you're really not going to want the auto exposure to be kicking on anyways. Next, we have lens flares. And if you're a fan of J.J. Abrams and Star Trek and Star Wars, then you're definitely going to want to mess around with these, especially if you have some kind of sci-fi environment with a lot of metals, a lot of smaller point lights that are kind of in your scene. These are going to be great, as they can kind of add just a little bit of extra flavor and flair to your environment, and then just give it a nicer sense of either realism or kind of just sci-fi feeling. So in this kind of natural environment, I don't really have any really good light sources. The kind of only thing I guess would be just this quick little ice plane that I made here. So you can start to see the lens flare taking effect. It's of course bouncing off the, just the glassiness of this ice and just bouncing back. This is mainly just because this plane is just a static plane with a reflection set to 0 and then some subsurface coloring on there. Nothing too fancy yet, but once it's more of a translucent ice color, you're not going to be getting this kind of like lens flare effect. But for metals and everything, this is a great way to just add in a bunch of different kind of effects to them. You can even tint them, get the overall tint of, what you want your lens flare to be based on whatever your light is. You of course can open it up and, just change the RGB values as well. We can also even open up the tints here and tint each individual little lens flare. So you just have to find the correct one that you want to like tint. And unfortunately, there are a ton of them. So finding out which one is which, you're going to have to like click around and eventually find it. But they all have the ability to kind of tint themselves and give a really nice look. And you can also come here to the bokeh size and increase or decrease that based on, whatever need you have. You also have the ability to add in a different shape in the bokeh shape. So if you had like a circle, or, there's a bunch of different kind of preset bokeh shapes that are very standard in any kind of camera that either does film or regular photography, and you can download those shapes just pretty easy. It's either circles or hexagons or kind of like just angular shapes that make these kind of nice bokeh effects for any of your lights. Again, you're probably not going to want the intensity too strong, as you don't want anything like these screen space, just extra additions to really get in the way of your environment. But if you are trying to sell this kind of film-esque look with this kind of effect, it's a great way to go. And we also have depth of field, but we'll go over that more next week when we're doing our final kind of screenshots, as it's easier to set up in the camera when we're going to be taking our final screenshots, and we don't really want to be messing around with that too much, as it can also hurt the performance of the engine occasionally. And you really want to just be able to have a nice shot to kind of either do your final tweaks with in terms of artistic placement of assets, as well as lighting and post effects. Two of the final ones I really want to go over are the ambient occlusion and global illumination. Now, ambient occlusion, I'm sure all of you know exactly what that is, but it's essentially allowing you to kind of get a nice shadowy area in between objects that intersect with each other. So we can, of course, increase the radius to get, a higher just intensity in our ambient occlusion, which will also affect any ambient occlusion textures we make. And then the radius is kind of the distance that it kind of falls off in between the surfaces. We also have the advanced tab where we can, go through here and adjust a bunch of these other kind of parameters. Really, the main one that I use if I'm going to be adjusting the ambient occlusion is the power, as well as the kind of fade out distances. So for the power, it's essentially just like our power in any of our shaders, and it's increasing really the contrast of that ambient occlusion. So our darks are going to be darker and our lights are going to be lighter. And then you can mess around with like the fade out, so you can get either the ambient occlusion to fade out either further away from you, or have it blur out when it's kind of farther away. So you can really use this effect to have areas that are kind of very far in the distance be kind of washed out. It's losing a lot of that ambient occlusion, as you might not want to have those objects that are all sticking together have these kind of harsh drawn lines. So you can do that with the fades and just kind of mess around with those and see how they are. If you have something like heavy fog in there, you're probably not going to notice the ambient occlusion effect too much. So that is just something to be aware of. And the last one is the quality, and the higher the quality is going to give a nicer, softer transition, whereas if you go down to a kind of lower kind of quality, it's obviously going to be better for performance, but it's going to be a bit more harsh and jagged. For environments, generally are not going to get too much out of this. This is more for kind of indoor areas where you're going to have a lot of these like nooks and crannies and crevice lights, and a lot of extra lights that help kind of accentuate the ambient occlusion. But just be aware that it's here, and it's definitely a good one to use. And the last one here on this panel that's probably really helpful for people is the global illumination. And this is pretty much just how much bounce light and what kind of indirect bounce light you want to have for your scene. You can increase the value here. It starts out as, a value of 1, and then you just increase it, and it'll just intensify the number of bounces light is taking once it bounces off the ground and onto another object. You can also increase whatever the color is to get this kind of tinting effect. So, maybe if you have a light in your scene, you're like, I want all these bounces to kind of lighten up the scene as like a red color. You can easily do that. I would say adjusting the kind of bounce color, probably not something most people will be using, but just increasing the intensity is something you might use if you are utilizing something that has a lot of color in the light and it needs a lot of extra bounces to just kind of stick that color on the object. So if we had a red light in here, or a blue light, or a green light, the higher this number is, the more it's going to be absorbed by the objects around them. And so that's it for the most part for the post-processing volume. There's a bunch of other like little tabs you can just kind of jump in and test out, but they're things I generally haven't found too useful. There's also a screen space reflection one, but generally it's just either going to be less or the default is at 100% screen space reflection. So these are things that are not probably too important, but you can go ahead, run through them, test them out. I would say the ones you really are going to want to like focus on are up here in the kind of color grading and the saturation contrast, as well as these kind of bloom effects and any kind of like lens flares, auto exposure. Those are the ones you're going to want to really check out to kind of enhance your scene and give it a really nice, cool look. Let's take a quick recap to see what we learned this week. So we started out the week by going over some of the main principles of lighting, figuring out how atmosphere, mood, and color can all accentuate and really give a kind of purpose and feeling to our environments. We saw some kind of key pieces of art from either films to really help us get an understanding of how saturation and color and just kind of tonal and mood can really affect your environment, and how we want to add those additions to our own spaces so that it kind of really stands out and pops. We then jumped into Unreal to kind of get the basic understanding of lighting. We started from scratch with the lighting in our kind of, nice middle pass, first pass scene of detail, as we don't need all the detail in there to begin lighting and getting a kind of feel and mood. We started out with adding some atmospheric fog and understanding how Unreal's atmospheric fog is attempting to fake the effect of light scattering through the atmosphere and kind of giving you this really nice look pretty easy with just some simple setup. We also took a look at skylights and how they can benefit a scene and lighten up a lot of the really harsh shadows that are created when we don't have a lot of lights around the scene to help kind of bounce things out. Skylights are great for especially large door environments, as you're not going to have the ability to place in all these like little small point lights to fake this kind of bounce light. So it's faking a lot of this indirect light, and it can help lighten up your scene. We also took a look at the Unreal's Blueprint Sky Dome. Now it's a fairly simple one, but it does its job pretty well. It gives us the ability to fake some nice clouds, as well as give us the ability to rotate the direction of our directional light, which is essentially our sunlight, and it will change the material and the kind of look of the sky dome based on the time of day to give an accurate, real representation of what it would be. We also looked at how we can kind of override these parameters and just adjust things however we want to if we don't really care about the time of day, but we mainly just want the cool clouds. We then took a look at Unreal's fog systems and the differences that those can give us to give a really nice sense of mood and purpose and weightiness to our scene. We checked out the difference between height and volumetric fog and how we can give a cool low-lying fog effect with the height fog, but we can also get a really nice overall kind of moody atmosphere with the volumetric fog, and to get some really cool light shafts in there. We then quickly jump back into Maya to get a better understanding of creating custom light maps. Now that our assets are pretty well established and they're not really going to change, creating light maps is a great way to go about working with your assets to give them a lot of extra detail in any of the baked lighting solutions. We looked at creating UV channels in the UV set editor and how we can bring in our original UVs from our asset, bring them over to our light map UVs, and then start stitching things together to get a cleaner, smoother, more continuous mesh of a UV channel for our light maps. We took a look at how light map UVs are best when kept in large kind of chunks and groups together, so you get less light map artifacting across seams. We also looked at the light mass importance volume in Unreal and understood that it is helping determine where we want to focus our lighting detail, where our light map and our light bakes are going to focus all its attention on, and how the areas outside of it are going to get a lot less importance and a lot less of the kind of just processing power, and how we can set our lighting from just the general default of preview all the way up to production, which we're going to use next week when we're taking our final screenshots. We then jumped into Unreal once again to look at the final Unreal post-processing volume and just all the options that it had in there. We saw that we could change the white balance, the tone mapping, the saturation, increasing contrast, changing gammas, changing the entire tint of our scene with just a few different sliders. We saw that we can add in some nice bloom effects, we can increase the ambient occlusion, and we can add in grain and other just small camera effects like lens flare and lens dirt to kind of give an extra little added boost to some of our final renders that we're going to have. These are not all necessarily, and you don't need to use all of them, but there are a lot of great options in there for you to really change up the mood of your scene really quickly and easy without having to go in and change every single texture or every material anytime you want to adjust the overall scope and look of your environment. Now let's take a look at what is expected this week for our class. So with this week being all about lighting, we want to see students establishing the look and mood of their scene with lighting. We want to get in, our close to final lighting with our scene. You might have temporary lighting in there now, which is totally fine, but we really want to establish what our final lighting is. We want to play with the lighting in our environment, try to get a nice balance between a 50-50 in shadow and in light to really help sell some really good contrast and kind of feeling in there. We don't want everything washed out in sunlight, losing a lot of our normals, a lot of our modeling details, but we also don't want that to lose that with our shadows either. So you need to try and strike that balance and find something that really sells your scene and that mood that you're looking for. We also want to harmonize our color palette. Now, when you're creating assets, it's easy for colors to just start going all over the place. And this is a good time to kind of rein things back in. Figure out what your color palette should be. What is the mood you are going for? With your fog, are you going for a heavy fogged out scene where you're not going to have a lot of colors? It's really going to be kind of monochromatic with just maybe pops of red or, pops of purple in there. Or are you going for something more friendly, warm, inviting, something very saturated that has a lot of colors, ideally clumped into their own small little sections together? So figure out what your kind of mood is and what you're going for in your scene and start to harmonize your color palette so it's not just literally every color under the sun. Finally, we want to see students test out some post-processing volume effects just so you have an understanding of how they work, along with a screenshot of what your lighting is looking and your desired kind of effect. I also want to see students mess around with some of the kind of color correcting abilities in, say, the saturation, the kind of bloom, or the white balance adjustments, just so we can see that you understand how to kind of adjust some of these sliders and how to get a better mood than what you just default have in your scene. Now, that isn't to say that it will be a better mood, but it's just a different one that can give you a good perspective on what you are building for your environment and just kind of allow you to step back and really figure out, is the environment that I'm making with these lighting changes, is this what I want? Or maybe some of these quick and easy post-processing effects can really change things up and you might want to take it in a different direction. It's a great way to quickly figure out what you're doing with your environment and if you want to change things or not. All right, so that's pretty much it for this week. Remember, you're not going to need to have any kind of crazy color corrected scenes, having these super crazy tones like the examples I showed with Mad Max or anything like that. That was just to give you an idea of what can be possible. We just also want to see you testing those out in your post-processing work so we can understand that you have the ability to do that kind of effect if you want to, and you want to really push the artisticness of your scene. If your overall scene calls for having a nice, bright, sunny blue day, that's totally fine and acceptable, and we just want to see the best of that as well. All right, now I know that was a bunch to go over, but I hope it'll brighten up your week, and I can't wait to see your lighting work.
Hi everyone, I am Pauline, and in this video I'll try to show you